Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith, Pennsylvania editor for the Center Square. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Anthony Hennin. This week, the House took an important step towards criminalizing possession of Xylazine, which is a an animal tranquilizer that is known on the street as Trank. It's something that's been infiltrating the illicit drug supply in Pennsylvania and across the country. So, Anthony, talk to us a little bit more about this bill that's moving in the House.
Yeah, so this was introduced by Representative Carl Metzgar, who's out in Somerset. And basically, he's kind of putting this in two ways. One is to make sure that the veterinary uses isn't threatened by the rise of Xylazine being used as a drug. And the second part of this, in Metzgar's view, is basically making sure that Xylazine is a felony offense, essentially as a way to make sure that people can get help and have the resources directed to them. Essentially, this bill would not categorize Xylazine as a scheduled drug. It would simply make Xylazine possession a felony offense outside of veterinary uses. And then, this could follow by up to 5 years in prison or a fine up to $15,000, essentially as a way to kind of, as Metzger put it, it's threading the needle that we need to between the licit and illicit use. Part of the issue that you have is you don't want someone doing Xylazine on the baby changing station of the Wawa. So, this is kind of a growing concern that we've seen in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia has been called the epicenter of Xylazine as it gets mixed in with other drugs like fentanyl. It can be more difficult because Xylazine is a sedative, so the overdose drug naloxone is ineffective against it. Naloxone only works on opioids, which fentanyl is. So we're kind of seeing this overlapping of urban and rural drug issues, where this is a drug that's being abused, but also there's a rural necessity component here on the farm.
All right, so I think there's two major questions that our listeners might be having at this point. When we talk about Xylazine, I think what it goes unaware to many people is how this would impact our food supply and the agricultural industry as a whole. So can you talk a little bit more about why it's important for that aspect of our economy?
Yeah, so Xylazine is basically, it's a high-grade, sedative tranquilizer that's generally used with cattle, with horses. The concern here is if farmers aren't able to get access to this drug, or, vets can't sedate cattle, the only alternative to that is euthanasia. So if they're not able, this could potentially affect Pennsylvania's food supply. It could have a significant economic hit simply because of how large Pennsylvania's agricultural sector really is.
All right. And then the other big question I think would be on the minds of listeners is, how does this potential law, make a difference as far as possession of Xylazine? Because, presumably speaking, if it's mixed in with drugs that are already illegal, it stands to reason how this will help the problem. But there is some nuance here as far as why criminalizing it and creating a legal charge against people who are found to be in possession of it, why that matters. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so when I spoke with Metzger, he basically argued that prohibiting Xylazine is necessary because there's no way to charge someone for illegally using it otherwise. And this also this idea of, you can approach people who are, have a substance use issue and try to get them into treatment, into recovery. But most of that is simply, it's voluntary. You can't force someone into help, either as a healthcare worker or as a police officer. So adding some sort of penalty on this can kind of force the hand of people of accepting some sort of, diversionary program to deal with substance abuse. Of course, with this move, there's critics as well arguing that this is not the right path to go. During the Senate's Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee hearing on Wednesday, when they voted to advance this bill, the loudest critic was Representative Emily Kincaid, who argued, I understand the need to address this issue because people are using this illicitly and it is causing problems, but this is not the way to do it. She said, essentially comparing this to what we've seen with other approaches during the war on drugs. She says, it didn't work with meth. It didn't work with cocaine. It didn't work with heroin. It didn't work with opioids. and it's not going to work with xylazine. It doesn't have a hope of being successful. So there's also some concern here of legalizing xylazine simply adds to a growing list of drugs that are prohibited, but also a growing list of drugs that are easy to obtain, easy to get, and unsafe.
Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Anthony Hennon, this is Kristen Smith. Please subscribe, and thanks for listening.